Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for this Museum Expert webinar, a very international webinar, I would say. And the topic, of course, is not strange to that, but we have people from Australia, Botswana, China, Brazil, etc., who have signed up. So we're very excited about that. We will not go into a deep presentation of what Museum Expert is. Maybe we come back to that after the question. I want to dig in immediately in the topic of today. And first welcoming Professor Mairesse from the Sorbonne in Paris, who is the author of that UNESCO report that we are going to discuss today. And so maybe Francois first tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we will speak about the report.
Yeah, okay. Just let me tell also that, of course, I wrote the report, but the official author of the report is UNESCO itself, of course. Yeah. And of course, I wrote it directly in connection with the team in charge of the museum sector at UNESCO, of course. And it is a UNESCO report. That's first. But of course, well, I was invited to contribute and to manage the first draft of this report. I have a PhD of well, it was not museology, museum studies, but of art history in Brussels. I became director of a museum in Belgium, and then I 10 years ago, I left Belgium for France and for Paris, where I teach museology and cultural economics at Sorbonne Nouvelle, and I also teach museology at École du Louvre.
Yes, very good, thank you. And for those who may not expect that, we know each other for 30 years, since we are
that's right.
both Belgian. Anyway. So tell me a little bit about the context. You mentioned it's a UNESCO report, but what was the context? When was it started? How did it come about?
Well, actually, I have been involved with UNESCO and with ICOM, I think since 2014 or something like that, when they were preparing a recommendation on museums, which is a very important document for a lot of states, member states of UNESCO. And that was approved by the UNESCO in 2015. And since 2015, there were some different reports. The first on the implementation of this very important recommendation in 2019. And then 1 year ago, of course, just after the COVID crisis started, and some countries proposed the lockdown, the total lockdown of infrastructures, etc. UNESCO wanted to first to create and to make a first report on the global state of museums confronted with the COVID crisis. So this is the second report that was asked to prepare. With, of course, all of the infrastructure of UNESCO, and UNESCO made they launched a very important survey among the member states. This is how it works, actually. They have two networks, I would say. They have different bureaus, different offices around the world, so they can ask to their people, to the UNESCO community, I would say, among all of the 47 or 50, almost 50 officers of UNESCO around the world. So this is a very first and important network that can help them to gather a lot of information for what concerns museums, theater, education, etc., etc. And then they can ask also to the member state themselves, because it's important to understand in order to understand the content of this report. It's important to realize, of course, that UNESCO talks to the member states. They do not talk to professionals somehow. Of course, they have some connections, such as ICOM. They have some connection with ICOM, with AAM, etc. But of course, AAM or ICOM have in common that they talk and their members are professionals. Of course, with UNESCO, the members are state members. So they asked to the ambassadors of UNESCO. Each country has an ambassador, and the ambassadors to UNESCO asked to their own cultural ministry or ministry, etc., at a national level.
So that means that the questionnaire that you have created or that was created has been disseminated through the countries, and then each country has decided themselves who they were sharing it with.
Exactly. It's important to understand that, of course, these are information. I would say that all of these information are official information, I would say. So it means that, of course, it gives an information, but it's very difficult to realize that there are not so many countries that have some good statistics and information concerning culture in general, but specifically museum and the museum sector. For instance, it's very difficult to know how many museums you have in your own country. For instance, in Belgium, it's very difficult because there are different communities, etc. But if you ask to the Ministry of France, how many museums are there? Actually, they could not really answer to that question. It appears to be silly somehow. It's exactly the same with United States somehow. Of course, now you have one source in the US, the Institute of Library and Museum Services, that make a huge survey, and they told that through this survey they had one figure that was. There are 33,000 museums in the US, but it could be. It's very interesting also to understand that each country has sometimes some different ways to count museums. So all of this information, of course, I would say they give a global picture. They do not tend somehow to be totally perfectly accurate, and I would say that in the cultural sector, it would be a totally, it would be somehow impossible, because actually the museum sector is very difficult to define, because the borders of the museum sectors are changing, and some institutions are exactly not the same, etc., etc.
And so the total number that you give, because it's like there are 104,000 museums in the world according to your survey, was that a surprise to you?
Well, actually, I'm very proud of this figure, because it's for the first time you could find a figure where there are more than 100,000 museums around the world. Because 2 or 3 years ago, the figure that circulated the most around the world was that there were somehow mostly 60,000 museums. And I had in mind that there were more. And these figures were based on the directory of museums in the world. But this is the reason why I had really in mind that it would be very important for UNESCO to try to coordinate these statistics and to try to ask to the member states, etc. And it's a work in progress, because for the last for the last report 1 year ago, the statistics we got give the result of something like 85,000 museums. Of course, now we have 100,004, and it's not exactly precisely that, but
it's an important figure. It's an important figure if you think about, and we will talk about that later, of the importance of that sector, not only in the community, but largely, more largely in the society in which they are operating, of course. So, and a couple of years ago, we did the exercise of trying to measure, and I'm from the science center field, and to count how many, and we came to close to 3,000, which is a very small number. People were saying, do you think really there was 3,000 science centers in the world? Well, probably there are. So, so now you have done the dissemination of, you got the questionnaires back, and you were able to draw a number of conclusions. So just, and the report also starts with the conclusion. So that's a good way for us to start as well. What are the major things that you learned from that report, from that survey?
Well, the very first important impression that I got when I realized these reports, these two reports.
Yeah.
It gives so well the impression that the COVID crisis is really a world phenomenon. And it's so impressive to see that in so many countries, in so small countries somehow, all museums were somehow influenced by this phenomenon. Because of course we know that in the US or in France or in Spain, etc., we know what is mostly the situation. But somehow we do not have, and at least I did not have, a global overview of the museum phenomenon and how it was brought to Africa, to the Arab countries, in Asia, etc. And what was the most interesting things? The first thing was that it was global. The second was that, well, you realize that mostly 80% of the member states closed partly or totally their museums, and the number of days was a kind of a very important surprise for me. There were so many countries that were closing their museums during 6 months or more sometimes, and even when the museums were not closed, because some countries did not close their museum, they realized that the figures of attendance dropped drastically, because of course the tourism was totally deteriorated throughout the world, and the repercussions for the museum sector were terrible somehow. And so it means that even if the museums were open, there was somehow nobody in there, almost, I would say. And this was, of course, very interesting to see, at least one of the first thing. Of course, the second point was the reaction of the member states concerning this closing. If they could help the museums, if they could raise the subsidies. And of course, for instance, in Western countries, especially in Europe, you know that the states helped a lot the cultural sector by raising subsidies, etc. And I would say that 25% of the countries had this type of global politics. And the subsidies remain stable for 25%. But as far as I remember, half of the museums, half of the states museum saw the subsidy declining, which was terrible, because first they had these drops of attendances, and second, the figures, the subsidies were declining. So it's very difficult. But and this is important also to understand, you have to get in mind that in mostly, I would not say all of the museums, because of course within the US or in the UK, etc., a lot of museums do not depend on the state. But in most of the majority of the states do own their museums, and mostly all, well, not all, but so many museums depend on the state, which means that the people who work there are civil servants, which means that they will not lose their jobs, at least for a lot of them. So they do not have a lot of visitors, they do not have a lot of subsidies, but for what concerns the jobs, the situation is somehow less difficult.
Yeah, and of course in the United States, in terms of staffing, we have seen that the closing of the museums has been accompanied by layoffs and people being fired, like to 60–70% in many cases of the museums. So that's been a very strong impact, of course. And so you then observed, what did the museums and how did they react to that situation? What were the things that they have been doing to respond to that crisis situation?
Well, actually, somehow I would say that all around the world, the museums, of course, the relation of museums to the public is important. And of course, all of the museums were so much involved in order to try to create and to continue to create a link with the public. Of course, they reacted digitally. And it's at that moment that you realize that, of course, inequalities is also digital, which means that, of course, some museums were already very well prepared. And they had some staff, they had some webmasters, they have some community managers working with social networks, etc. So of course it was very easy for them to continue. And some museums, but actually I would say not so many museums, tried even to invest and to hire some more people to work digitally. But most of the museums did not have the possibility to do that. So a lot of them used social networks, Facebooks, etc. And some of them, of course, were using some investments that were made by digitalizing collections or making some working with the Google Art Center, etc. And of course, these were the most, I would say, popular phenomena. Most of the museums were visited through, I would say, digital investment that were made much earlier before the COVID crisis. And somehow also, it was always the richest museums, I mean, the most frequented museum, that they continue to be the most frequented museum, visited museums through internet.
As well, yeah. Well, there are maybe other examples of that, but maybe we come back to that in the questions. So when I look at the report and I see in two different places, on page 6, the report says in thinking about the situation that museums looking to the future were a little bit worried about their relation with the public.
Yeah.
And that was, I'm wondering what you actually meant by that. And then in the conclusion, it comes back somehow, because then you say, the respondents mentioned concerns that relate to the transformation of visiting practices. And I suppose that relates to online things. But is that the only reason? Why are the museums concerned about the visiting practices post-COVID?
Well, actually, this is a thread that was written by a lot of member states, telling, well, at least from professionals from member states who answer to the survey. It means that actually a lot of museums, well, when you are closed, of course you have some relation with if possible, you have some relation with the digital public, but somehow you are frightened by saying, well, by thinking, well, when it will open again. By the way, actually, French museums are just opening today, so I'm very pleased about that. But when it will open, will the public come again? And a lot of them are puzzled about this, and they see it not as an opportunity, but as a difficult solution. They also know that a lot of people will not travel during a lot of time. So, of course, we know that the situation for what concerns, for instance, the touristic industry will not be the same in 2021 or 2022 as it was in 2019.
So the concern is more about the numbers rather than about the practices.
Yeah, sure. Well,
okay.
That's the first point, but the second point should be, of course, also the practices, because some people think that the visitor who discovered, I would say, digital visits will continue to use digital visits and will not come anymore. Of course, I do not believe in this at all, but it was a threat.
Yeah, and indeed, so just you say museums in France are opening today, same case in the United States. And for example, the National Museum of African History and Culture opened last week. And on TV, everybody was complaining that after an hour, all the tickets were gone because everybody wanted to come back to the museum. Same thing with the National Zoo. I tried to organize a visit with my kids for the next, I cannot have tickets for the next month. So, and we have heard that in many places. We think that we can be very optimistic in terms of people want to come back. But my question is, and that's relating to what you just said, they have learned about online activities. So it's not that they have missed learning somehow. What did they miss? What is it that pushes them to come back as soon as they can?
Well, well, this is a bit more about my own reflection than and thoughts than of course what is written in the report. But what I would say is the following. The real importance of the museum is not actually just in learning. Of course, learning is something important, but there are a lot of different ways for learning. But of course, the museums mean something totally different. It's definitely not the same when you see a picture of somebody. Well, of course, I guess that all of us, we had some aperitifs and drinking party through Zoom or through internet. Of course, it's something nice, but it's definitely not the same experience than by drinking together. And it's exactly the same with museums. It means that, of course, the museum is not just a place for learning and for learning information. It's definitely a space for relation with people, a space for being together, and of course, a space for seeing real things. And real things is something so important. Somehow, of course, the connection with the real thing is something that might be kind of electric. To see a painting, to see I don't know, the Apollo spaceships, etc., or an old plane, or a dinosaur, etc., is definitely not the same as seeing it through internet or with a picture.
So you don't think that the whole trend of going digital during COVID is something that will remain after, and that we're gonna go back to physical visits, or what is it? Is it gonna be a hybrid type of formula? What do you think it's gonna evolve to?
What I believe is actually the fact that a lot of museums discovered that they could reach some people, and they could provide some information, and they could provide some tools that are very important for the global public, but they could reach some other publics. They could give some information and bring some information to schools, etc. Different ways of learning. And it's another possibility. But I would say it's something that is possible. It will not replace it. It's something different. And of course, the whole world of possibilities through internet, with internet, and the museums are huge. And what we did during the pandemics was just, to my mind, a very small possibility for what concerns the whole global possibility, the world of possibilities for what concerning what could be a real museum through internet.
And when you speak about new audiences, new publics, new audiences that you can reach with this, are you thinking about age groups, or are you thinking about other parts of the population? Like we spoke about the digital divide, so it may very well be that this digital divide still does not allow you to reach all the populations that you want.
What is amazing is the point that, of course, you have no borders when you are through internet. So it means that you could reach some Chinese people, or some people from, I don't know, from Europe, from Belgium, from France, from Germany, etc. So it means that, of course, you can reach some people that you would never reach physically. Mm-hmm. And of course, that there would be some visitors that will maybe will not come at all to your museum or to your science center, etc. But they could have a relation with you. And it means then that the total possibility of the public is totally different. And you could go global somehow with at least some topics, mm-hmm. But so, not all of them, of course.
Yeah, this of course somehow comes to the relation that you as an institution have with the community where you live in, and more largely the society where you are in. So we have seen also some concerns during COVID about the relation and the place of a museum in their community, and so can you tell us a little bit about that?
Mm-mm. Yeah, it was, well, at least it was a major concern of UNESCO since 2015, and something that I believe that was very important is the social role of museum. Of course, this is an old story, and it started much earlier before, at least 100 years ago. But the relation between the museum and its community was already, of course, a very important point for UNESCO. And of course, so there were some questions concerning the relation of the museum and the community and its social role in the questionnaire. And of course, what happened is the fact that a lot of museums realized that, of course, the COVID crisis had, of course, a lot of difficult consequences for what concern not only the relation with the community, but the community itself. So it means, of course, that the museum, seeing that they were closed, were thinking, what could we do for the community? And of course, well, you spoke about your children. You know that during the lockdown, a lot of people had some troubles with their children because the schools were closed, etc. And a lot of museums in different countries created some games, specific games for children, in order to give them some occupation or some courses, etc. And it means that actually they really wanted to provide, to help people by trying to at least to be useful, I would say, and not to be useful in a classical way, in order to try to invent some other possibilities to be useful.
So the relation to the community for me is a little bit larger than that, in the sense that when we think about how COVID has impacted the communities, and especially in the US, I would say, many populations around the museums have been impacted very differently, and especially Latino and Black communities in the United States. So how can the museum actually play a social role by handling this situation that happens outside of the museum? Because the impact of COVID has somehow touched their audiences, but some of these audiences, like Black and Latino people here in the US, some of them did not come to the museums before. So when you try to rebuild the relationship with your community and you involve in that a sort of a inclusive, how do you do that? Because people that you may want to touch were never museum visitors before.
Well, actually, it really depends on how you conceive the role of the museum, and it really depends on your own museum also. I mean, each museum is different, and each museum has a different relation with its community. Actually, the ID itself of the community is very different. At least in the US, it has a different meaning than in Europe, for instance. But still, if you just think about the community as a territory with people, of course, you know that a lot of people do not go, etc. The very important thing to my mind is was given by actually one of the father of museology, which is George Bongood, famous director of the Smithsonian Institution. You know, he wrote the museum administration in 1896 or something like that. And well, he was a zoologist, he was a biologist, and his idea was very important because his main point at that moment, I mean, 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, his main point was seeing and studying somehow the museum as a global system in an ecosystem, which was the community, and the relation of the museum with the population, but also with all of the different institutions, schools, libraries, archives, universities, but also somehow maybe the churches, all of the institutions of the territory. Why do I say that? I believe that if the museum could help, they might help sometimes also indirectly. I mean, of course, they could. The most important is that the museum would like to, if he really wants to help, the most important should be to try to link all of these institutions and asking, okay, you are doing this, I'm doing that, but maybe I could bring this to help some people, etc. And to my mind, helping the community does not mean that you should provide access. Well, you should provide access, of course, to everybody, but that everybody should go and come and visit your museum. It's maybe not the most interesting point.
The way that I'm looking at this, Professor, is in this way, is that after COVID, all communities, and let's take the very broad US definition of that, will have to rebuild somehow. And they will have to rebuild and support people who have lost jobs and things of that sort. People who have been sick and people who have lost family members and all of that. So there's going to be a very big moment of rebuilding where the public and that public needs to be reassured, safe, and we're working on the well-being of the community. So the community is going to have a plan to do that. The place of the museum at that point, if I understand you well, is that not necessarily to say you should come back because we provide you stuff that you need for your education or for your development, but we as a museum want to be part of that plan. How can we actually help that plan of rebuilding, and what should we listen to in the community to decide what we are going to do in the next years? Is that what you say?
Somehow, yeah. I believe that it's sometimes not exactly the right answer. Should be first to listen, to be sure. Well, not to bring one solution, but first to listen in order to understand what is the requests, what is really the needs, and well, it's also the possibility that if you want to learn something and well, to provide some information, what is the information you have? Maybe if people do not come to your museum, it's also because they do not get any information they are interested by, or they do not find any information on their own past. You know, when the Anacostia Museum in Washington was built, it was built because actually at that moment there were no information at all about the past of people from Anacostia anywhere. And even if the museum in the Washington Mall were free, etc., people would not go. And even if they were there, they were nothing about their own heritage, their own past. So what resulted at that moment was the fact that, okay, we have to work on this past, we have to provide some information, and we will, and it was definitely the idea behind this community, this neighborhood museum that was conceived by John Kinnett, who was a wonderful American thinker about this. It was first to consult the population and to work together, to create some committees with the population and try to decide about what should be the activities, what should be the exhibitions, etc.
So it makes me think that in the report you make, you referred to the movements that happened here in the US last year with the Black Lives Matter movement, which was not only a US phenomenon, but very quickly became a worldwide movement to address systemic racism. And so the report speaks about that. In what sense has that been so important during the COVID period to see that happening at the same time? And what is the response of the museums to that?
Well, it's at least it proved to be very important in Western countries, I would say, because I did not see it in Asian countries, for instance, at that moment. So we just have to realize also that we have a closed view on what is the museum sector, because of course at that moment, of course it used to be it proved to be very important in America and in Europe at least. what happened at that moment was the fact that, of course, we knew, and all of the countries, all of the member states know that a lot of people will suffer. So a lot of people will become poor after the COVID crisis. There should be a very strong economic crisis for a lot of people. And this means inequalities, more inequalities, and more divisions. And of course, especially the US were confronted with the Black Lives Matters, of course, and it spread around the world. Actually, I would say that this is also a result of inequalities. And the most important was, I would say, the inequalities. And of course, at that point, a lot of museums that believe that their role, at least partly, is a social role, and some museums that think that the total role is social, but some others do not believe in this, but at least a lot of museums believe that they have at least a part of a social role to play. Mm-hmm. And at least this social role is to try to work on this inequality reduction. And this inequality, it might, of course, be inequality for what concern wages and races, discrimination, gender inequalities, etc., etc., by providing a lot of possibilities, by providing food for thoughts, through exhibitions, through activities, through events, but also by working on archives, etc. But also maybe also to provide some places in order to work together, etc.
Yes, and we see this in the last months. Many museums have really made statements about their place they think they have in that role of addressing social injustice and at least the race, the systemic racism, etc. And I think that it's quite important that they have spoken the words to do that. And so we hope now that this is going to translate in something practical. That is not, of course, the very difficult step. How do you go from this intention, and I think the genuine interest of museums, most of them, to really address that, but they are only part of society. They cannot change society on their own. So finding the right place for your museum is of course, a very, very challenging balance. So this being said, there's a side question maybe, but I've always wondered if the place in society and the relation to the community that you can have with a museum, is that the same for an art museum and for a science museum? And I can see that for a science museum quite well, because I can see the importance of science to explain how you have to behave in terms of COVID, for example. You know, if you have to accept to be vaccinated and all of these things. So I can see there is a very direct role that you can play. How does an art museum do that?
Well, actually, it really depends. You are totally right, and there are a lot of differences among museums, but especially between art museums and science museum. Another very influential director, which is Benjamin Gilman, said that art museums were temple in their essence, and science museum were schools in their essence. It was in the beginning of the 20th century. And somehow it means that, of course, the museum is not just one museum. And the very important point to me is that the museum is a very complex phenomenon, where you have a lot of categories, and not only, I would say, science museums or art museums, but some museums are much more devoted to research or to conservation, and some others are very focused on their communities, community museums, etc. It's much more clearer with the library sectors. For what concerns libraries, you have some libraries that are dedicated to the academic, to universities, and some others that are dedicated to conservation. And the public libraries behave totally differently. And they use books totally differently. They make research totally differently. And sometimes they do not make any research. So I would say somehow that the important point is the fact that it's not the point of being art museum or a science museums, but it's the point to have in mind a specificity, or to be built, and it's a relation with your community or with your public. What kind of public do you have actually? Yeah. You might have a science museum that would be totally connected to the community as a whole, or and to be that would be very much involved socially, and some other science centers that would be very elitist somehow. And it's of course definitely the same with art museums. Of course, you would find, I would say, maybe more art museums that are very elitist. I would say are very directed
narrow part of
to heritage and to the appreciation of art, etc. But if you could see, for instance, the example of the very important museum of Montreal, the Museum of Fine Art in Montreal, that invented some relations with arts and through art therapy, that invented the concept of museotherapy, where the doctors of Montreal could make some prescriptions to people who would feel ill. Okay, I propose you to go to the museum. And so you could see that, of course, they could definitely play a social role. And for instance, that museum played it very well.
And which lead to some of the conclusions that all the statements in the report, where UNESCO actually affirms that museums are really key players in changing things in society. And they take the example of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as one example. And from my point of view, it's not that I disagree with that. I disagree with the practice of that, in the sense that I have done that for the last 10 years, starting with the Rio +20 summit. And what I have found is that it's very difficult to translate this very global concept of development goals into very local action. And that people in museums locally find it difficult to translate that into things that matter to their community. So I feel it's a little bit of a wishful thinking from UNESCO here.
Well, somehow the UNESCO is UNESCO. I mean, like all international organization, you have you know that you have a specific language. You have UNITION and UNESCO language somehow that works with recommendations and global political agendas, etc. And of course, this is a kind of very political level with that is more linked with diplomacy than with very specific actions. But concerning this, well, of course, and I guess that it was the business of UNESCO to continue to recommend that. They were, of course, it's a UNESCO report. I would have written, if I had to write it myself, just as myself, it would have been written totally differently, of course. And so that's the first point. The second point is that actually, and I was very much concerned, and some museums and some countries that answered were also concerned with the aims of this agenda, but actually the aims of other so important potential crises, such as the climate change and the disaster that would come because of the climate change. That, of course, it could be frightening, and definitely also museum could definitely be much more involved in this in order to try to realize by being forums, by inventing some more exhibitions, etc. Of course, in science museum, but not only in science museum. It could be also the same with all community museums, etc. Because what are the practical results of climate change or the raising of inequalities? They are very practical, actually. It means raising of violences, etc., and or more migrations, and then more violence, etc., etc. So it means that a lot of people think, well, of course, we are now, I would say, obnubilated by the COVID crisis, but the COVID crisis could be just a very small point if you just consider the global agenda. And this global agenda, it will come very quickly somehow. So a lot of people would say, okay, just shouldn't we think that the most important point is this global challenge that we are going to be confronted with?
Yeah, and I think I agree, and it refers to the first thing that you said, is that what the COVID crisis showed is that the globality of this problem, it touches everybody everywhere, as climate change will, and it shows also the fact that there is a relation between the COVID crisis and the way that man acts with nature in general. So if there is not a global answer to that, we're not going to be able to fight these consequences. That's for sure. I'm going to have two more questions before we go to the Q&A from the audience. And that is one thing that, of course, we as museum experts have in mind is so many people have lost their jobs. And now there is reopening and museums are going to hire again. What is the perspective about staffing of museums? Do you have an idea if museums are going to hire same people or different people because of what has happened?
Well, it's just a feeling, I would say. Of course, I would say that, of course, they might hire not exactly the same. What I'm sure about is the fact that after 2 or 3 years, they will have at least as many museum professionals that they were before the crisis. If we just consider the crisis, the financial crisis of 2008, at that moment, just after the crisis, I remember that the Metropolitan Museum in New York had to cut at least 25% of its staff. And the budget, of course, was cut drastically also. And at the same moment in Europe, most of the museums did not cut at all the staff, etc. But 5 years later, there were more people at the Metropolitan Museum, and the budget was even more important than it was before. So, I mean, the fact actually, especially in the US, is definitely linked with the market economy, which means that, of course, when you have a crisis, directly you have a very hard reaction. But as soon as it's solved, I would say, of course, people are going to hire sometimes a lot of more people, but definitely they might try to think differently. And of course, I would say that the two main concerns are: the first, of course, digital, and the second would be definitely linked with these topics, such as how could we react to Black Lives Matters, and how could we go much deeper and help better with all of these inequalities problems, etc. So definitely, I would say that these are certainly very important topics to dig, and of course possibilities to think about how could you form yourself in order to be good in this market.
And just as a reminder for those who are listening, on June the 3rd, we will have exactly a webinar on that topic, because we have identified a number of things that change in the way that museums are going to hire to respond to the two things that you say, but also to more than that, and the way that they're going to operate their museums in a different way because of that. And they look at very different skills than before. tune in on the June the 3rd for that. My last question, and it's inspired by something that was, we could see the question that we received in advance. Who is working on the big plan to avoid the situation we have been in with COVID?
Actually, I would say that we should remain humble. And actually, one important lesson that that was given by COVID is the fact that actually most of us we couldn't believe that such a kind of crisis could happen. And it means that even if you try, that you have the impression that you would control everything, there will always something that you will not control. And actually it means that, of course, something somehow is much more severe could happen again. And that it's not possible somehow, that you should be definitely flexible, that the sense of adaptation is the most important, definitely. And the museum that reacted the best were also the museum that adapted the best. And of course, the sense of adaptation, the sense of resilience, of being resilient to a situation, etc., is so important, especially in a crisis moment. But it might prove to be the most important, one of the most important tools that you would have to try to be flexible and to adapt to something that could happen very fastly, very rapidly, and that could, well, just think about a war.
So we're going to stop here because we don't have a lot of time anymore, and I want to make sure that that we have questions from the audience. My excellent colleague Tamara Schwarz, who is one of the pillars of MuseumExpert so far, has been monitoring the chat box, and she is going to come up with some questions. So Tamara, it's all yours.
Thank you. I think we'll turn to a question that was posed by Elif, and she asked about how you think museums can get buy-in from local businesses and and other sectors. Sort of harkening back to your comments about the social role of museums, and so she asked about skills such as empathy, perspective shift, creative thinking, and how we can position museums as hubs for dialogue-based programs.
Well, actually, my point, well, it's very difficult to answer this question, because I could not be able to provide some tools, some do-it-yourself tools in order to give this. But what I could answer is that the museum works with 3 pillars. These 3 pillars are the market, which means businessmen, etc., as well, of course, as the public. So you have one possibility. You have a second possibility, which is the state, and I mean the different level of the states. And even though I know that in the US the support of the state is much less important than in most of the countries, but actually it still is, and it's actually what, as far as I know, it might be a bit more important within the next years. So there is a global trend. I don't know if it's a long trend, but at least there used to be a very long trend since the 80s until now, with a decline of the state. There might be some changes, and it couldn't be totally impossible. So the second point is actually that the state is also is also something that could be interested. And when I think about the state, I think about a lot of foundations depending on the state, etc. And the third sector is philanthropy and is the gift economy, which is also a totally different way of considering things, because all of these 3 supports have 3 different logics. I mean, what is the priority? What are the tools? is different, which means that actually when you try to address, at least if you want to survive, you should try to be flexible. What is interesting is if you just depend on the market, if the market collapses, it means that actually you will totally collapse also. So that's the reason why to be flexible means to be linked with all of the different stakeholders that exist. And some of these stakeholders might be business people, etc. Some others could be totally different also. You could find and provide some help. And at least the more relation you have with all of the stakeholders, that could be people from local states or local governments, that could be people from the schools or universities or archives or libraries, or also from churches and all local societies. The most useful you will be. And then, and it's also a very important American that said this in 1920 or something like that. You understood that I'm very pleased to learn about history, but I think that a lot of people already told and had a lot of very good and interesting solutions. A museum will be maintained by its city if it proves to be useful, said John Cotton Dana in 1920. And of course, to be useful would mean, okay, how can it be useful to you? And to you, it might be to be useful to a manager. It might be to be useful to a foundation or to the school, etc. Of course, you can not work with all of these people. It means that you have to make some choices, but actually the possibilities are very important. And the more flexible you are, the bigger view, the global view you have, the most global view you have, the better.
Tamara.
Great, thank you for that. I think that the other point that has come through throughout this conversation has been, the relationship between digital programs and in-person programs. And there were several questions on that front, including, how digital programming perhaps has an important role to play in serving school audiences. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that point.
Could you just turn around the question again? I'm not sure.
Sure. Yeah, so this is a question that was posed by Lisa Bernstein, and she said, have museums embraced the idea that the digital awakening is a potential lever to increase equity, especially for school-age children, by creating more access to a museum's content?
Well, actually, I would say that most of the museums had a very classical reaction by providing tools that were already on paper or that were already, I would say, given by guides, etc., through the web. And of course, it's interesting to have this type of view, but for what concerns myself, I would say that the most important, of course, it's very important to continue to develop that, and secondly, also to try to build some things that are possible through internet, but that they are not possible through papers or through global and classical conferences, etc. But my second point is definitely the fact that you should just focus also very radically on what is the specificity of the museum. If you really want to be sure that people would be attracted and to continue to visit your museum, you should have in mind why our museum, and it's the same idea and the same question that I have been in mind since, I don't know, 30 years or even more. what is a museum? What is the specificity of a museum? And why is it so useful? Why do I come? Why do I go to visit a museum? And actually, the more you have this in mind, the better answers you will have. But this is kind of endless question somehow, I would say, and thankfully.
And if I may comment on that and bring together what you said earlier about this, is that it's not either or. It's going to be what is your role for the museum, but we have learned through the pandemic that maybe with some tools we can increase our reach to people who are not coming to the museum, who are more difficulties. And even, you know, I have an example here from one of our colleagues in New Mexico, in Explora, where they have done these online activities, but because they still didn't reach the right people, they worked with newspapers from the Black community rather than online, because they had to add that to make sure that they were reaching everybody. Maybe Tamara, the last question before I conclude.
Let's see. I think we've addressed, you did a pretty good job of addressing the questions throughout the conversation, actually. So
I had an eye on it a little bit.
Yeah.
So well, thanks, and I think that thanks, Tamara, for this, and always great job. So I want to thank Professor François Mairesse for this conversation, and of course this is recorded, and so we will certainly use that in the future. But I would like to end with this, and the report also ends with that, is that one of the recommendations is we should continue to have a conversation about the impact of COVID and how we respond to that. And that's the most important thing. We should not forget suddenly when we are all vaccinated that everything is gone. It's not. The world is changed, and we need to continue the conversation. And that's what we with MuseumExpert want to do. And I remind you, we will have a webinar on the 3rd of June about who will we hire, and how are we rewriting our job descriptions to make sure that we hire the right people, and how do people who are out of work now have to adapt to that new situation to make sure that they can continue in the museum field. And after that, we're going to do a webinar that's really focused on inclusion and diversity. How practical can we be to make sure that we are proactively serving these communities in our hiring procedures as well? So that is our long-term plan so far. Thanks again to Professor Mairesse, thanks to Tamara, thanks to all my team at MuseumExpert for making this possible, and thanks to all of you who were watching today. I see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.